What happens when a king's absolute decree meets a daughter's unbreakable will? When love becomes the ultimate act of rebellion that could topple a throne. King Aldrich had forbidden his daughter, Princess Seraphina, from even speaking to the blacksmith's son she'd fallen for, believing that royal blood should never mix with common dirt. But when she defied him in a way that shocked every noble in the court, she didn't just break his rules. She shattered everything he thought he knew about power, love, and what it truly means to be royal. This isn't just another forbidden romance. This is the moment when a princess discovers that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from a crown, but from the courage to love without limits, even when that love could cost her everything she was born to inherit. Today I'm going to tell you an incredible story about a king who thought he could control hearts the same way he controlled kingdoms, a princess whose rebellion became the stuff of legends, and the commoner whose love was worth more than all the gold in the royal treasury. But first, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? I love seeing our global community grow. And if you're ready for a story that combines royal drama with a love so powerful it rewrote the rules of an entire kingdom, smash that like button and hit subscribe with notifications on. Because what Princess Seraphina did when her father tried to separate her from her true love, it's going to show you that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't raising a sword, it's refusing to let go of someone's hand. Are you ready to witness a love story that changed history? Princess Evangeline Ravencrest had always known that loving Thomas would be her downfall, but she never imagined it would happen quite so spectacularly in front of the entire royal court. The morning began like any other in the grand palace of Meridia, with servants bustling through marble corridors and courtiers whispering behind jeweled fans. But by noon, her father King Aldrich had issued a decree that would change everything. "Let it be known throughout the realm," the royal herald proclaimed from the palace steps, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, that Princess Evangeline is hereby forbidden from any contact with the commoner Thomas Ashworth, son of a blacksmith, under penalty of exile from the kingdom. Standing at her tower window, Evangeline felt her heart shatter as the words echoed through the courtyard below. At 22, she had spent 3 years secretly meeting Thomas in hidden alcoves and moonlit gardens, their love growing stronger despite the impossible barriers between them. He was brilliant, kind, and had taught himself to read and write despite his humble origins. Everything the noble suitors her father constantly paraded before her were not. "Your Highness," came a soft voice behind her. Lady Margaret, her elderly chambermaid, approached with the careful steps of someone delivering devastating news. "His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the throne room." The throne room was packed with nobility, their faces a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed excitement at the drama about to unfold. King Aldrich sat on his golden throne like a statue of judgment, his stern features carved from stone and disappointment. Beside him stood Prince Roderick of Astoria, the latest in a long line of political marriage proposals that Evangeline had managed to deflect through various excuses. "Evangeline," the king's voice boomed through the hall, using her full name in a way that made every courtier lean forward in anticipation. "You have brought shame upon the crown and disgrace upon our royal bloodline. Your association with a common blacksmith's son ends today." "Father," Evangeline began, stepping forward with as much dignity as she could muster. "Thomas is a good man, honest and intelligent. He is beneath you in every way that matters," King Aldrich interrupted harshly. "You are a princess of Meridia, destined to marry royalty and secure alliances that will protect our kingdom for generations. I will not have you throw away your duty for some romantic fantasy with a man who smells of soot and iron." The cruel words sent murmurs through the assembled court, but Evangeline held her head high. "And what of love, father? What of happiness? What of the right to choose my own fate? Love." The king's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Love is a luxury that royalty cannot afford. You will marry Prince Roderick within the month, cementing our alliance with Astoria, and you will put this foolish infatuation behind you like the child's game it has always been." Prince Roderick stepped forward, his handsome face wearing an expression of smug satisfaction. At 35, he was wealthy, powerful, and had already buried 2 wives under mysterious circumstances. The thought of being bound to him for life made Evangeline's skin crawl. "I will not marry Prince Roderick," she said clearly. her voice carrying to every corner of the throne room. "I will not be sold like cattle to secure your political alliances." The gasps from the assembled courtiers were audible, but King Aldric's face had gone dangerously calm. "You will marry whom I command you to marry, when I command you to marry them. That is not a request, Evangeline. It is a royal decree. And if I refuse, then you will be stripped of your title, exiled from Meridia, and left to fend for yourself in the world with nothing but the clothes on your back." The king's voice had grown deadly quiet. "You would be dead to me, dead to this court, and dead to the kingdom you were born to serve." The throne room fell silent as the weight of the threat settled over everyone present. Exile was essentially a death sentence for someone raised in royal luxury, with no practical skills and no allies in the outside world. "Furthermore," King Aldric continued, "Thomas Ashworth will be arrested and charged with seducing a member of the royal family. The penalty for such treason is death by hanging." "No." Evangeline's composure finally cracked. "You cannot punish him for my choices." "I can and I will," the king replied coldly. "Unless you agree to marry Prince Roderick and formally renounce any claim to love this blacksmith's son." It was a masterfully cruel trap. Evangeline could save Thomas by sacrificing herself, or she could follow her heart and watch the man she loved die for the crime of loving her back. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "You have until sunset," King Aldric declared. "Make your choice, daughter. Your duty to the crown, or your infatuation with a commoner who will drag you down to his level." As the court began to disperse, whispering excitedly about the drama they had witnessed, Prince Roderick approached Evangeline with the predatory smile of a man who believed he had already won. "Your Highness," he said with mock courtesy, "I want you to know that I bear you no ill will for your youthful indiscretions. Once we are married, I'm certain we can find ways to make our union satisfying for both parties." The way he said it made Evangeline's blood run cold, but she simply nodded politely and excused herself from his presence. As she made her way back to her chambers, her mind was already racing with possibilities, plans, and desperate schemes. What the court didn't know, what even her father didn't know, was that Princess Evangeline had spent the past 3 years doing more than just falling in love with a blacksmith's son. She had been learning from him, studying with him, and discovering talents that no royal tutor had ever thought to cultivate in a princess. Thomas had taught her to read accounts, manage finances, and understand the real workings of the kingdom beyond the luxury of court life. More importantly, he had shown her the records he kept for his father's smithy. Records that revealed something about Meridia's economy that would shock everyone who thought they understood how the kingdom truly functioned. As sunset approached and the moment of choice drew near, Princess Evangeline prepared to give the court a demonstration they would never forget. She was about to prove that sometimes a commoner's love could be worth more than all the noble blood in the kingdom. The question was whether anyone would still be standing when the dust settled. The royal treasury chamber had not seen a princess in over 50 years, its heavy oak doors typically reserved for the king's most trusted financial advisors. But as evening shadows lengthened across the palace, Princess Evangeline stood before those doors with a key she had obtained through methods that would have scandalized the court even more than her love affair with a blacksmith's son. Thomas waited in the shadows of a nearby alcove, his strong hands stained with the honest dirt of his trade, but his eyes bright with the intelligence that had first captured Evangeline's heart. In the 3 years of their secret courtship, he had taught her more about the real workings of the kingdom than all her royal tutors combined. "Are you certain about this?" he whispered as she turned the key with steady hands. "If your father discovers what we're doing—" "He'll discover it anyway when I present my case to the court," Evangeline replied quietly. "The only question is whether I'll have the proof I need to back up my accusations." The treasury chamber was smaller than she had expected, lined with ledgers that chronicled 3 decades of Meridia's financial dealings. But Evangeline knew exactly what she was looking for, thanks to Thomas's patient instruction in reading account books and recognizing the patterns that revealed corruption. "Here," she said, pulling down a leather-bound volume that chronicled the kingdom's military expenditures for the past 5 years. "And this one." Another ledger, this one detailing the royal household's expenses. "And most importantly, this." The third book was smaller than the others, bound in black leather and hidden behind the more official-looking volumes. When she opened it, Thomas let out a low whistle of amazement. "By all the saints," he breathed, reading over her shoulder. "This shows payments to foreign mercenaries, bribes to neighboring kingdoms, secret loans that the royal council knows nothing about." "My father has been financing a private war," Evangeline said grimly, her finger tracing the damning entries. "He's been hiring foreign soldiers to attack Astoria's trade routes, then presenting himself as their potential ally against the very enemies he's secretly funding." The implications were staggering. King Aldric's insistence on her marriage to Prince Roderick wasn't just about political alliance. It was about covering up an elaborate scheme that would be considered an act of war if discovered by Astoria's court. "But that's not the worst of it," Thomas said, pointing to another section of the secret ledger. "Look at these payments to Lord Chancellor Pemberton." Evangeline studied the entries, her blood growing colder with each line. "He's been embezzling from the kingdom's tax revenues. No wonder the people are struggling while the court lives in luxury." "And here," Thomas continued, his voice tight with anger, "payments to silence families whose daughters died under suspicious circumstances while serving in the palace." "What do you mean?" "I mean your father hasn't just been corrupt, Evangeline. He's been covering up murders. Young women who found out too much about his schemes, who asked too many questions, who posed threats to his secrets." The chamber suddenly felt colder, and Evangeline realized they had uncovered something far worse than simple political maneuvering. Her father wasn't just a corrupt king, he was a killer who eliminated anyone who threatened his power. "We have to get this information to the court," she said, her voice steady despite the horror of what they had discovered. "The nobles need to know what kind of man they've been serving." "And risk your life in the process?" Thomas took her hands, his calloused fingers gentle against her soft skin. "Evangeline, if your father has killed to protect these secrets, what do you think he'll do to his own daughter?" Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Multiple people, moving with the measured pace of guards conducting a search. "He knows," Evangeline whispered, her heart racing. "Someone must have seen us." Thomas was already moving, gathering the most damning ledgers and stuffing them into a leather satchel. "There's another way out of here," he said quietly. "A service passage that leads to the kitchens. The servants use it to move supplies without disturbing the court." But as they reached the hidden door Thomas had discovered during his years of sneaking through the palace to meet Evangeline, the main entrance to the treasury chamber burst open. King Aldric himself stood in the doorway, flanked by 6 guards with drawn swords. "Step away from my daughter, blacksmith," the king commanded, his voice carrying deadly authority. "And surrender whatever you've stolen from the royal treasury." "We haven't stolen anything," Evangeline said, stepping protectively in front of Thomas. "We've simply discovered the truth about your corruption, father. About the secret war you've been financing, the money you've stolen from our people, the murders you've covered up." King Aldric's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a cold calculation that was more terrifying than rage. "I see," he said quietly. "And what do you intend to do with this truth?" "Present it to the court," Evangeline replied, though her voice had begun to shake. "Let the nobles and the people decide whether a king who steals from his own subjects and murders innocent women deserves to keep his crown." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," King Aldric said with deadly calm. "You see, daughter, you and your blacksmith friend have just confessed to treason. Breaking into the royal treasury, stealing sensitive documents, plotting to overthrow the rightful king, these are all capital offenses." "The only treason here is yours," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the swords pointed at his chest. "You've betrayed your own people, your own kingdom, your own daughter." "Have I?" King Aldric smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any anger could have been. "Or have I simply done what was necessary to keep Meridia strong? The weak die, Thomas. The strong survive. And sometimes survival requires unpleasant choices. Like murdering your own subjects. Like eliminating threats to the stability of the realm, the king corrected smoothly. Which is what you've both become. He gestured to his guards, who began to advance with drawn weapons. Kill the blacksmith, he commanded. Make it look like he was caught stealing from the treasury and resisted arrest. As for my daughter. Father, please. Evangeline began. As for my daughter, King Aldrich continued as if she hadn't spoken. She will marry Prince Roderick tomorrow morning and never speak of what she thinks she's discovered here. Because if she does, if she breathes a word of these accusations, I will have Thomas's entire family executed as co-conspirators in his treason. It was the same cruel trap as before, but now the stakes were even higher. Not just Thomas's life, but the lives of his parents, his younger sister, everyone he had ever cared about. You're a monster, Evangeline whispered. I'm a king, Aldrich replied. And kings do what they must to protect their kingdoms, even from their own daughters. But as the guards moved forward to carry out their orders, Princess Evangeline did something that shocked everyone in the chamber, including herself. She began to laugh. The sound of Princess Evangeline's laughter echoing through the treasury chamber was so unexpected, so wildly inappropriate to the deadly situation, that even the advancing guards hesitated. King Aldrich's face cycled through confusion, anger, and finally a flicker of uncertainty that his daughter had never seen before. Have you lost your mind, child? He demanded. But there was something in his voice that suggested he was beginning to doubt his control of the situation. No, father, Evangeline said, her laughter subsiding into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. I've found it. You see, you made one crucial mistake in all your scheming and murdering and political maneuvering. And what mistake was that? You assumed I was as naive and helpless as you've always pretended I was, she replied, pulling a small leather pouch from her gown. You assumed that 3 years of secret meetings with Thomas meant nothing more than romantic trysts and stolen kisses. King Aldrich's eyes narrowed as he recognized the pouch. It was identical to the ones used by the kingdom's official messengers, bearing the royal seal that made its contents legally binding throughout the realm. What you didn't know, Evangeline continued, is that Thomas has been teaching me far more than just how to read account ledgers. He's been teaching me about trade, about commerce, about the real sources of Meridia's wealth. And most importantly, he's been helping me establish my own network of contacts throughout the kingdom. What are you talking about? But King Aldrich's voice had lost its certainty. I'm talking about the Guild of Artisans, father. The blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, and merchants who actually produce the goods that make our kingdom wealthy. The same people you've been taxing into poverty to fund your secret wars and corruption. She opened the pouch and pulled out a scroll sealed with wax that bore not the royal arms, but the hammer and anvil symbol of the Artisans Guild. This is a formal petition, signed by every guild master in the kingdom, demanding a full audit of the royal treasury and an investigation into the mysterious deaths of young women in the palace. The blood drained from King Aldrich's face. Impossible. The guilds would never dare challenge royal authority under normal circumstances, Evangeline agreed. But these aren't normal circumstances. You see, I didn't just steal these ledgers tonight, father. I've been copying entries from them for months, documenting your crimes, building a case that even the most loyal noble couldn't ignore. She pulled out a second document, this one bearing the seals of 3 neighboring kingdoms. This is a trade agreement, negotiated directly between the Artisans Guild and the merchants of Astoria, Caldris, and Whitehaven. An agreement that bypasses the royal court entirely and establishes the guilds as independent trading partners. That's treason. King Aldrich snarled. That's business, Thomas said quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. Princess Evangeline discovered that the guild masters have been discussing such an arrangement for years, but they were afraid to act without royal protection. So she provided it. What protection could a powerless princess possibly offer? The protection of someone who actually understands economics, Evangeline replied. You see, father, while you've been playing your games of war and murder, I've been learning how money really works. And what I've learned is that Meridia's wealth doesn't come from your political alliances or your military threats. It comes from the skill and labor of people you consider beneath your notice. She gestured toward the stolen ledgers. These books prove that you've been systematically looting the kingdom's real sources of income to fund your personal vendettas. But what they also prove is that the guilds have been generating far more wealth than the royal court ever realized. Enough to operate independently, Thomas added. Enough to hire their own security, establish their own trade routes, even build their own infrastructure if necessary. King Aldrich was beginning to understand, and the realization was clearly terrifying him. You're talking about revolution. I'm talking about evolution, Evangeline corrected. The world is changing, Father. The old ways of ruling through fear and force are dying out. The kingdoms that will thrive in the coming decades are the ones that learn to work with their people instead of against them. And you think the guild masters will follow a princess who throws away her birthright for a blacksmith's son? I think they'll follow someone who has proven she understands their needs and respects their contributions, Evangeline said firmly. Someone who sees them as partners rather than subjects to be exploited. She pulled out a third document, and this one made King Aldrich step backward as if he'd been struck. This is a formal declaration of independence, filed with the Royal Registry this afternoon. As of sunset today, the guild territories of Meridia are no longer subject to royal authority. The guild territories? The eastern provinces, where most of the smithies, workshops, and craftsmen are located, Thomas explained. Nearly a third of the kingdom's population and more than half of its economic output. They can't do this, King Aldrich whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. They already have, Evangeline said. And they've elected their first prime minister. She smiled at Thomas, her love for him shining in her eyes despite the danger surrounding them. Thomas Ashworth, son of a blacksmith, now the elected leader of the most economically powerful region in what used to be your kingdom. The throne room fell silent as the implications sank in. King Aldrich's corrupt rule had lost him not just his daughter's love, but a substantial portion of his realm. The guards looked uncertainly between their king and the princess who had just announced she was no longer their subject. You've destroyed everything, King Aldrich said, his voice hollow with shock. I've saved what could be saved, Evangeline replied. The people who actually create wealth and prosperity in this land now have a chance to govern themselves without corruption and murder poisoning their efforts. And what of you? He asked. What of your royal blood, your noble birthright? Princess Evangeline looked at Thomas, then back at her father, and made the choice that would define the rest of her life. I choose love over power, she said simply. I choose partnership over dominion. I choose to build something new rather than preserve something rotten. Then you are no daughter of mine. No, she agreed sadly. I suppose I'm not. But as King Aldrich raised his hand to signal his guards to attack, Princess Evangeline played her final card, one that would shock the court even more than her previous revelations. As King Aldrich's hand began to fall in the signal for his guards to attack, the great doors of the treasury chamber burst open once again. But this time, it wasn't more royal guards who entered, it was a procession that made everyone in the room freeze in disbelief. Prince Roderick of Astoria strode through the doorway, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came Duke Edmund of Caldris, Duchess Catherine of Whitehaven, and most shocking of all, Queen Isabella of Valdres, 4 of the most powerful rulers in the known world, all armed with documents that would change everything. King Aldrich, Prince Roderick said, his voice carrying the formal authority of someone conducting official royal business, by the power vested in me by the Continental Council of Monarchs, you are hereby under arrest for acts of war against sovereign nations, embezzlement of international trade funds, and conspiracy to commit murder. The words hit the chamber like thunderbolts. King Aldrich's face went from rage to confusion to dawning horror as he realized that his crimes had been discovered not just by his daughter, but by the very kingdoms he had been secretly attacking. This is preposterous, he sputtered. You have no authority in my kingdom. Actually we do, Queen Isabella interrupted, producing a scroll bearing the seals of 7 kingdoms. Princess Evangeline's evidence reached our courts 3 days ago, along with a formal request for international intervention. The Continental Council has voted unanimously to suspend Meridia's sovereignty pending a full investigation. What evidence? King Aldrich demanded, but his voice shook with the knowledge of what was coming. Duke Edmund stepped forward, holding one of the ledgers that Evangeline had copied months earlier. Evidence of your hiring foreign mercenaries to attack Astoria's trade caravans while simultaneously negotiating a marriage alliance with Prince Roderick. Evidence of your embezzlement of guild taxes that were supposed to fund international trade agreements. And most damning of all, evidence of your systematic murder of anyone who threatened to expose your crimes. You can't prove. We can prove everything, Duchess Catherine said coldly. Princess Evangeline didn't just copy your ledgers, Your Majesty. She interviewed the families of your victims, documented the patterns of disappearances, even located some of the foreign mercenaries you hired and convinced them to testify in exchange for immunity. Thomas stepped forward, his common-born status meaning nothing in the face of the evidence he carried. Show them the testimonies, he said to Evangeline. She produced another bundle of documents, these ones written in the shaking hands of grieving parents and terrified witnesses. 17 young women, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. 17 daughters of Meridia who discovered pieces of your corruption and were murdered to keep them silent. Maria Thornfield, age 19, found dead in the palace gardens after questioning why the guild taxes had tripled, Thomas read from the first testimony. Eleanor Westbrook, age 22, discovered drowned in the castle moat after she noticed discrepancies in the military budget. Sarah Caldwell, age 18. Enough. King Aldrich roared, but his voice cracked with desperation rather than authority. There will never be enough, Queen Isabella said firmly. These women deserved justice, and their families deserved truth. Princess Evangeline has ensured they will receive both. Prince Roderick, who had been strangely quiet since arriving, finally spoke. Your Majesty, he said, addressing King Aldrich with icy formality, I came here to marry your daughter as part of a political alliance. Instead, I discover that you've been staging attacks on my kingdom's commerce while negotiating in bad faith. The marriage contract is null and void, and Astoria demands reparations for 3 years of economic warfare. But the alliance, King Aldrich began desperately. Will proceed as planned, Prince Roderick interrupted, turning to look at Evangeline with something approaching respect. Just not with you. The Continental Council has voted to recognize the Guild territories as an independent nation, with Prime Minister Thomas Ashworth as its elected leader. Astoria will be honored to establish formal diplomatic relations with this new realm. The implications hit King Aldrich like a physical blow. Not only had he lost a third of his kingdom, but the international alliances he had sacrificed everything to obtain were being transferred to the very people he had dismissed as beneath his notice. Furthermore, Duke Edmund added, the Council has voted to impose trade sanctions on what remains of Meridia until full reparations are paid to the families of your victims and the kingdoms you attacked. This is madness, King Aldrich whispered. I am a king, anointed by God, ruler by divine right. You are a murderer and a thief, Thomas said quietly, his blacksmith's hands steady as he faced down the man who had tried to have him killed. And your reign of terror ends today. The Continental Council has prepared a formal offer, Queen Isabella said, producing yet another document. Abdicate your throne, confess your crimes publicly, and accept exile to a monastery where you can spend your remaining years in prayer and contemplation. In exchange, your life will be spared and the remaining portions of Meridia will be allowed to choose their own government. And if I refuse? Then you will be tried for your crimes before an international tribunal, Prince Roderick said with cold certainty. And I can assure you that the penalty for murdering 17 innocent women will not be exile to a comfortable monastery. The chamber fell silent as King Aldrich realized that every path before him led to the loss of everything he had schemed and killed to protect. His corruption had not only cost him his daughter's love and a third of his kingdom, it had made him an international pariah who would be lucky to escape with his life. You planned this, he said to Evangeline, his voice hollow with defeat. All of it. The investigation, the guild independence, the international intervention. I plan to save as many people as possible from your tyranny, she replied. I plan to ensure that your victims received justice and that their deaths meant something. I plan to build a better world from the ashes of your corruption. And I plan to marry the woman I love, Thomas added, in a country where her worth isn't determined by her bloodline and my worth isn't dismissed because of my common birth. King Aldrich looked around the chamber at the faces of the people who had once feared him, his daughter who had outmaneuvered him, the blacksmith he had tried to murder, the foreign royalty who now held his fate in their hands. The game was over, and he had lost everything. Very well, he said finally. I accept exile. But Princess Evangeline wasn't finished yet. She had one more revelation that would shock everyone present, including the man she loved. As King Aldrich's formal abdication was being prepared by the assembled foreign dignitaries, Princess Evangeline drew Thomas aside to a corner of the treasury chamber. Her expression carried a mixture of love and apprehension that made his heart race with anticipation and dread in equal measure. There's something else I need to tell you, she said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into her gown and withdrew a document that looked far older than anything else they had discovered that evening. What is it? Thomas asked, though something in her expression told him this revelation would be even more shocking than her father's crimes. My mother's genealogy, Evangeline said, unfolding the parchment to reveal an intricate family tree that stretched back centuries. The real one, not the sanitized version that's displayed in the royal gallery. Thomas studied the ancient document, his intelligence quickly grasping the implications of what he was seeing. Your mother wasn't just nobility, he said slowly. She was the rightful queen of Meridia, Evangeline confirmed. My father didn't inherit his throne through bloodline, Thomas. He married into it. And when my mother died under mysterious circumstances 5 years ago, he killed her too, Thomas finished, his voice heavy with horror and understanding. She discovered his corruption and he murdered his own wife to keep it secret. Which means, Evangeline continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, that I'm not just a princess by birth. I'm the rightful queen of Meridia, and have been since my mother's death. My father has been a usurper for 5 years, ruling a kingdom that legally belongs to me. The implications were staggering. Not only had King Aldrich been corrupt and murderous, but his very claim to the throne was fraudulent. And if Evangeline was the true queen, this changes everything, Thomas said, his mind racing through the political ramifications. The international treaties, the guild independence, even the marriage contracts, they all have to be renegotiated with the legitimate ruler. Yes, Evangeline agreed. And as the rightful queen of Meridia, I have certain powers that a mere princess would never possess. She turned to address the assembled foreign royalty, her voice carrying new authority that made everyone in the chamber stop their conversations and turn to listen. Your Majesties, she said formally, I must inform you that the abdication you're witnessing is not legally valid. King Aldrich cannot abdicate a throne that was never rightfully his to begin with. Prince Roderick frowned. What do you mean? I mean that my mother, Queen Cordelia, was the hereditary ruler of Meridia, and upon her death 5 years ago, the crown passed to me as her only child. My father has been ruling as a regent at best, a usurper at worst. She held up the genealogical document. This is the original royal bloodline of Meridia, sealed and witnessed by the royal registry. It clearly shows that the crown passes through the maternal line, not the paternal. Queen Isabella examined the document with the trained eye of someone well-versed in royal lineage disputes. This appears authentic, she said finally. If this is genuine, then Princess Evangeline, or rather, Queen Evangeline, has been the rightful ruler of Meridia for 5 years. Which means, Duke Edmund added thoughtfully, that all treaties signed by King Aldrich during that time were negotiated under false pretenses. And all his crimes were committed not just as a corrupt king, but as a man who had illegally seized power from its rightful owner, Duchess Catherine observed. The political ramifications were enormous, but Thomas was focused on something more personal. Evangeline, he said quietly, if you're truly the Queen of Meridia, then you can't just abandon your throne to marry a blacksmith's son. Your people need you. My people need honest leadership, she corrected. They need someone who will work with the guilds instead of exploiting them, someone who will protect the innocent instead of murdering them, someone who will build prosperity instead of stealing it. She turned to face the assembled royalty. Which is why I'm proposing something that has never been attempted in the history of our kingdoms. A constitutional monarchy that shares power between the crown and elected representatives of the people. You're talking about revolution, Prince Roderick said, but his tone was curious rather than condemnatory. I'm talking about evolution, Evangeline replied, echoing her earlier words to her father. The world is changing, and the kingdoms that survive will be the ones that change with it. Thomas stepped forward, understanding what she was proposing. A government where the Queen provides stability and international diplomacy, while elected officials handle domestic policy and economic management. Exactly, Evangeline said. And the first Prime Minister of this new constitutional monarchy would be Thomas Ashworth, elected by the guilds and confirmed by the Crown. You want to marry your Prime Minister? Queen Isabella asked, raising an eyebrow. I want to marry the man I love, Evangeline said simply. The fact that he's also the best qualified person to help me rebuild this kingdom is just an added benefit. King Aldrich, who had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, finally found his voice. You can't be serious. You're talking about giving power to commoners, to people who have no understanding of statecraft or diplomacy. I'm talking about giving power to people who actually understand how the kingdom functions, Evangeline interrupted. People who know how to create wealth instead of stealing it, how to build instead of destroying, how to lead instead of ruling through fear. She gestured toward Thomas. This man has spent 3 years teaching me more about economics, trade, and governance than all my royal tutors combined. He understands the real needs of the people because he is one of them. And he loves you, Queen Isabella added with a slight smile. Which is more than can be said for most royal marriages. The proposal has merit, Duke Edmund said thoughtfully. A constitutional monarchy would provide stability while allowing for democratic representation. It could serve as a model for other kingdoms facing similar challenges. You're all mad, King Aldrich said desperately. This will destroy everything we've built. Everything our ancestors fought to preserve. Everything you've built is already destroyed, Thomas said quietly. The question now is whether we build something better in its place, or whether we let Meridia collapse into chaos and civil war. Princess, now Queen, Evangeline took Thomas's hand, her decision made. I choose to build something better, she said. With the man I love, for the people we both serve. But as the assembled royalty began to discuss the implications of this unprecedented political experiment, none of them noticed the figure lurking in the shadows outside the Treasury chamber. Lord Chancellor Pemberton, whose name had appeared throughout the corrupt ledgers, and who had been listening to every word of the conversation that would destroy his own power and wealth. The revolution was about to face its first test, and it would come from an enemy they hadn't yet realized they had made. Lord Chancellor Pemberton had served 3 kings over the course of his long career, but he had never faced a crisis quite like the one unfolding in the Treasury chamber. As the assembled foreign royalty discussed the unprecedented constitutional monarchy that Queen Evangeline was proposing, he slipped away from his hiding place and moved quickly through the palace corridors with the desperate urgency of a man whose entire world was crumbling. In his private chambers, surrounded by the wealth he had accumulated through decades of embezzlement and corruption, Pemberton began composing letters that would either save his position or ensure that everyone involved in his downfall would pay the ultimate price. If King Aldrich was finished and Queen Evangeline was determined to expose every corrupt official in the kingdom, then he would make certain that her reign was too short to accomplish her goals. Meanwhile, in the Treasury chamber, the negotiations were proceeding with remarkable smoothness. Queen Isabella had proposed formal recognition of the new constitutional monarchy by the Continental Council, while Prince Roderick suggested a series of trade agreements that would help stabilize Meridia's economy during the transition period. There is one concern, Duke Edmund raised carefully. The nobles who supported King Aldrich's rule, they won't simply accept this change without resistance. Many of them have been profiting from the corruption, and they'll see constitutional monarchy as a threat to their power. Which is why we need to move quickly, Thomas said, his strategic mind already working through the practical challenges. The longer we delay implementing these changes, the more time our enemies have to organize opposition. What do you propose? Queen Evangeline asked, though her expression suggested she already knew what he was thinking. A public coronation within the week, he replied. Not just a ceremony, but a formal presentation of the new government structure to the people. Let them see that their new queen stands with them, rather than above them. And let them see that she's chosen a commoner as her prime minister, Prince Roderick added with approval. Nothing would demonstrate your commitment to change more clearly than elevating someone from outside the nobility. As they continued planning, none of them noticed the young page who had been sent to deliver refreshments to the chamber, a boy whose loyalty belonged not to the crown, but to the coin that Lord Chancellor Pemberton had been paying him for information about the royal family's activities. By dawn, Pemberton's letters had been dispatched to every corrupt noble and foreign enemy who had profited from King Aldric's schemes. By noon, a conspiracy was taking shape that would test the new queen's resolve and her blacksmith's courage in ways neither of them had anticipated. The first sign of trouble came during the formal announcement of the new government structure. Queen Evangeline stood on the palace balcony, addressing a crowd that had gathered in response to rumors of dramatic changes in the kingdom's leadership. Beside her stood Thomas, no longer dressed in a blacksmith's leather apron but wearing the formal robes of a prime minister, though he still bore the honest calices that marked his humble origins. People of Meridia, Queen Evangeline's voice carried clearly across the plaza, today marks the beginning of a new era for our kingdom. An era of partnership between crown and citizen, of prosperity shared by all who contribute to our realm's success. The crowd's response was enthusiastic, particularly from the guild members and common workers who had suffered under King Aldric's oppressive taxation. But from the balconies and windows where the nobility watched, the reaction was far more reserved. Furthermore, the Queen continued, I am pleased to announce that the first Prime Minister of our constitutional monarchy will be Thomas Ashworth, elected by the Guild Council and confirmed by the Crown. Together, we will rebuild Meridia as a kingdom that serves all its people, not just those fortunate enough to be born into wealth. It was at that moment that the trap was sprung. A crossbow bolt whistled through the air, aimed directly at Queen Evangeline's heart. Thomas moved without thinking, throwing himself in front of the woman he loved and taking the steel point in his shoulder instead of allowing it to find its intended target. As chaos erupted in the plaza below and guards rushed to secure the balcony, more attackers emerged from concealment throughout the crowd. They wore no identifying symbols, but their coordinated movements and professional equipment made it clear that this was no spontaneous uprising. It was a carefully planned assassination attempt. The Chancellor, Thomas gasped, pulling the bolt from his shoulder as Queen Evangeline helped him to safety behind the stone balustrade. He's the only one who could have organized this so quickly. Guards! Evangeline shouted, but her voice was nearly drowned out by the sounds of battle erupting throughout the palace grounds. Secure Lord Chancellor Pemberton immediately. But it was too late. Even as her loyal guards fought to restore order, Pemberton was already fleeing the palace through secret passages he had used for decades to conduct his corrupt business. In his wake, he left behind evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond Meridia's borders, letters from foreign agents promising support for anyone who could eliminate the new queen and restore a more compliant ruler to the throne. The assassination attempt failed, but it succeeded in demonstrating just how dangerous Queen Evangeline's reforms would be to the corrupt networks that had been profiting from the old system. As Thomas was treated for his wound and the bodies of the attackers were examined for clues, it became clear that the battle for Meridia's future was far from over. We can't govern under siege, Thomas said grimly as palace physicians bandaged his shoulder. If we're constantly fighting assassination attempts and foreign interference, we'll never have the stability needed to implement meaningful reforms. Then we end the threat, Queen Evangeline replied with steel in her voice. We hunt down every conspirator, expose every corrupt alliance, and make it clear that the price of opposing legitimate government is higher than the cost of accepting change. You're talking about war, Prince Roderick observed. He had remained in the palace to help coordinate the response to the attack, and his military experience was proving invaluable. I'm talking about justice, the Queen corrected. And sometimes justice requires the willingness to fight for it. As night fell over the palace and reports came in of similar attacks being organized in other cities throughout the kingdom, Queen Evangeline and Prime Minister Thomas prepared for a conflict that would determine whether their unprecedented experiment in democratic monarchy would survive its first week. The stakes could not have been higher. Not just their own lives, but the future of governance itself hung in the balance. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the palace walls, Lord Chancellor Pemberton was gathering allies who would stop at nothing to preserve the old ways of corruption and exploitation. The revolution was about to face its greatest test, and the outcome would shock courts throughout the known world. 3 days after the assassination attempt, Queen Evangeline stood in the great hall of the palace, but she was no longer surrounded by the golden luxury that had defined royal ceremonies for centuries. Instead, the space had been transformed into something unprecedented in royal history, a joint session of the traditional noble council and the newly formed guild assembly, meeting as equals to determine the fate of the kingdom. Thomas sat beside her, his wounded shoulder still bandaged, but his eyes bright with the intensity of a man who understood that the next few hours would determine whether their revolutionary government would survive or die in its infancy. Around them, the assembled representatives created a tableau that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. Dukes and duchesses sitting alongside blacksmiths and carpenters, merchant princes debating policy with farmers and weavers. "My lords and citizens," Queen Evangeline began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed hall, "we gather today not as rulers and subjects, but as partners in determining Meridia's future. The attacks against our government have forced us to confront a fundamental question. Will we allow fear and corruption to drag us back into the darkness, or will we move forward together toward something better?" Lord Pemberton was conspicuously absent, having fled the kingdom after his conspiracy was exposed. But several nobles who had been implicated in the corrupt schemes remained, and their spokesman, Earl Blackwood, rose to address the assembly with barely concealed hostility. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "while we all deplore the violence that has occurred, we cannot ignore the fact that these attacks began only after you announced your intention to share royal authority with commoners. Perhaps the realm would be more stable if traditional governance were restored." A murmur of anger rose from the guild representatives, but Thomas raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned his position through merit rather than birth. "Earl Blackwood," he said, "traditional governance gave us a king who murdered 17 innocent women to hide his corruption. Traditional governance bankrupted the royal treasury to fund personal vendettas. Traditional governance turned our kingdom into an international pariah whose only allies were criminals and mercenaries. Better a corrupt king than a blacksmith pretending to be a statesman," Earl Blackwood shot back. "Better an honest blacksmith than a corrupt earl," Thomas replied calmly. "But perhaps we should let the people decide which kind of leadership they prefer." Queen Evangeline stood, and the authority in her bearing made everyone in the hall fall silent. "Earl Blackwood raises an important point," she said, her words causing looks of surprise from both sides of the assembly. "The legitimacy of any government must ultimately rest on the consent of the governed. Which is why I am proposing something that has never been attempted in our kingdom's history." She gestured to a group of court scribes who had been preparing documents throughout the morning. "A formal referendum, to be held throughout Meridia over the next month. Every citizen over the age of 18, noble and commoner alike, will have the opportunity to vote on whether they wish to continue with constitutional monarchy or return to absolute royal rule." The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Direct democracy was a concept so radical that most kingdoms considered it dangerous heresy. "Furthermore," Queen Evangeline continued, "to ensure that this choice is made freely and fairly, I am temporarily suspending all royal authority during the referendum period. Prime Minister Thomas will serve as acting head of government, with a council of representatives from both the nobility and the guilds to ensure that no faction can manipulate the process." Earl Blackwood's face had gone pale. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. Allowing peasants to vote on matters of governance." "Allowing citizens to determine their own fate," Thomas corrected. "If our government truly serves the people's interests, then we should have nothing to fear from their judgment." "And if they choose to return to traditional monarchy?" one of the guild representatives asked. "Then I will honor their decision," Queen Evangeline said simply. But I will also ensure that any future monarch rules according to laws that protect the innocent and prevent the corruption we have worked so hard to expose. As the assembly erupted in heated discussion, Prince Roderick, who had remained as an observer representing the Continental Council, approached the royal platform with an expression of amazed respect. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "what you're proposing, it could change the nature of governance throughout our world. If a kingdom can successfully transition to rule by popular consent, then other kingdoms may follow our example," Queen Evangeline agreed. "And perhaps future generations will live in a world where power serves the people instead of the other way around." Over the following weeks, as the referendum campaign unfolded across Meridia, something remarkable happened. The choice between constitutional monarchy and traditional rule became secondary to a larger conversation about what kind of society the people wanted to build together. Guild masters and reformed nobles found themselves working side by side to address common challenges. Farmers and merchants discovered shared interests in fair taxation and honest trade. Even former supporters of King Aldrich began to see the benefits of a system where corruption was exposed rather than hidden. The assassination attempts continued, but they were increasingly met by citizen militias who had organized themselves to protect the democratic process. Lord Pemberton's foreign allies found that their gold could no longer buy the loyalty of a people who had tasted freedom and representation. When the votes were finally counted, the result was overwhelming. Nearly 3/4 of Meridia's citizens chose to continue with constitutional monarchy, with many specifically requesting that Queen Evangeline and Prime Minister Thomas be confirmed in their positions for life. But the most shocking moment came during the victory celebration, when Queen Evangeline made an announcement that no one had expected. "My dear friends and fellow citizens," she said, addressing the crowd that had gathered in the palace courtyard, "you have chosen to trust us with your future, and Thomas and I are honored to serve. But we believe that true democracy requires more than just the consent of the governed. It requires the ongoing participation of the people in their own governance." She turned to Thomas, who stepped forward with a document that would transform their personal love story into something even greater. "Therefore," Thomas announced, "we are establishing the Meridia Foundation for Democratic Governance, dedicated to helping other kingdoms transition to constitutional monarchy. And to demonstrate our commitment to the principles we've advocated, Queen Evangeline and I are formally donating our personal wealth to fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects throughout the kingdom." Furthermore, Queen Evangeline added with a smile that lit up her entire face, "We are pleased to announce our engagement, not as a political alliance, but as a partnership between two people who believe that love and democracy are both strengthened when they are freely chosen rather than imposed by authority." The cheers that erupted from the crowd could be heard throughout the kingdom, and the news of Meridia's transformation spread quickly to courts across the continent. Within a year, 3 other kingdoms had requested assistance in establishing their own constitutional monarchies, and the Meridia model became the foundation for a new era of democratic governance. Queen Evangeline and Prime Minister Thomas were married in a ceremony that was attended by representatives from every social class in the kingdom, held not in the palace chapel but in the public square where their love story had first shocked the court. Their reign became legendary not for its power or wealth, but for proving that sometimes the most radical act of love is the willingness to share power with those you serve. And in the end, the blacksmith's son and the princess who chose him became the founders of a new kind of kingdom, one where the crown served the people, and love conquered not through force, but through the simple revolutionary act of treating others as equals. The court had indeed been shocked by what Princess Evangeline did, but they had also been transformed by it. And the transformation continued to spread, one kingdom at a time, proving that some love stories are powerful enough to change the world.